Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out to today's symposium. My name is Kushal Kadakia. I'm a junior studying biology and public policy and a proud member of the 2016 class of Huang Fellows. Our first panel for today is titled The Postmodern Prometheus, and is a play on Mary Shelley's original title for the novel, and alludes to the central scientific struggle of the novel as well as in today's society, the boundaries between man, nature, and God. In the book, Mary Shelley dubs Victor Frankenstein as a modern Prometheus for stealing the secrets to creation by reanimating flesh. And in some ways, this really parallels the hopes as well as the dangers of the genomic era, in which we have technologies like CRISPR that can edit out the diseases encoded into our DNA. But at the same time, science is a field that's really characterized by self-regulation and self-criticism, with practitioners of the arts always trying to balance the intellectual curiosity with the broader social implications of their work. Today's panel will try to grapple with some of those questions, and I'm really excited to introduce our distinguished panelists, Professors Misha Angrist, Professor Arti and Professor Charles Gersbach, who will try to grapple with the central question of when does science and the quest for knowledge go too far. And so to start off, I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves and maybe share their thoughts on that opening question. Misha?
Thanks, Kushal. It's great to be here. So I'm Misha Angrist. I direct the undergraduate certificate in Science and Society. I taught Frankenstein in the fall, and if you're interested, this edition that was put together by some people from Arizona State has been annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all kinds. So as far as I know, that's the sort of first iteration of the book that has been directed at scientists. I guess the only other thing I'll say is something we talked about a little bit at the film event we had last night, which was this idea of being the modern Prometheus, and how Victor Frankenstein doesn't actually do full Prometheus. He accesses this technology, this ability to reanimate a human, but he doesn't really share it with anybody.
So I teach at the law school, and I direct the Center for Innovation Policy at the law school, in addition to also being a faculty member of the Margolis Initiative, Center for Health Policy, and I'm an associate of Science and Society. So I think that the reason that I may have some insights on this question is that I started out doing some work in bioethics and medical ethics, have kind of moved away from that and focused more on intellectual property, but definitely have continued to think about these questions as I can, because as it happens, ownership questions end up, specifically patent ownership questions, end up implicitly and explicitly sometimes raising the kinds of ethics issues in which you may be interested. And so I think that on the high level, the observation I would have, and this is based on having also been in government, doing science and technology policy in government as a political appointee during the early years of the Obama administration. The observation I would have is as follows, that in the United States, at least, we have an emphasis on markets, and we believe in patents, frankly, which is my area, really rely upon markets more than anything else. And so we believe that for the most part, markets will do what they will, and we regulate relatively lightly relative to those markets, and that's where law comes in to regulate. But it is a very light touch regulation relative to at least some other countries, although perhaps not as light touch as certain other countries, say China. But that is the international comparison I draw, that this country tends to be wary of regulation, even in democratic administrations, which was the one in which I served. So that's one piece of the puzzle, which means that we have to rely perhaps more on self-regulation than other countries and norms. And in a pluralistic society that is also now very polarized, as you well know, relying upon norms and self-regulation is a fraught enterprise at best. And so those are the thoughts I would just offer as an initial take at Kushal's question.
So I'm Charlie Gersbach. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering and director for the Center for Biomolecular and Tissue Engineering. And I guess I'm here because I work directly with some of these technologies like CRISPR. And so some of the work that we've done in my lab involves using these types of tools like CRISPR to go in and correct mutations that cause genetic disease. And we've done that in patient cells and in animal models. And I guess relevant to maybe some of the comments we just heard, we work with some of the biotech companies that are trying to actually drive this forward into actually being able to help the patients that are affected with these diseases. And another part of my research is not just using some of the existing genome editing, genome modifying tools, but working to develop new ones. And a lot of our emphasis in that area has been using these types of tools, not just to modify gene and genome sequences, but also to change epigenetics and gene regulation, which is another form of inheritable genetic information, but is common to or applicable to a whole other set of diseases. So both in applying these tools for correcting disease and then also developing new ones.
So for our first question for the panel, in the book, Victor Frankenstein's central research question is on how to evade death. And I think that's one that's plagued humanity for a very long time and will continue to do so. But particularly in the research world is prevalent with the Silicon Valley focus on anti-aging startups and new research about telomere extension and how you can prolong life. And so I'd be curious to ask, given this theme of life extension, what values should try to guide this research and maybe what regulations should be in place?
No, you're handing it to me. Okay, I think you should take that first.
So I wish I could remember when it was. There was a long piece in the New Yorker within the last couple of years where there are a bunch of Silicon Valley luminaries gathered at someone's house, and they're talking about life extension, and there are sort of two camps. One is what I would presume is probably more closely aligned with what Charlie's doing. You know, how can we repair broken genes to cure disease and thereby extend life? And then the other transhumanist camp, which is, I'm going to live forever. And more closely aligned with the singularity and maybe some more far-fetched ideas. And trivia, this discussion was moderated by former Duke Chancellor Victor Zhao, who from the article seemed kind of uncomfortable. So I think it's a great question, and you know, I edit a Genome magazine, which you can read for free at genomemag.com, the in-flight magazine of genomics. But we get pitches, I wouldn't say all the time, but we've gotten more than one pitch from writers saying, I want to write about life extension. And again, I'm happy to entertain the former idea of how can we improve public health, how can we use gene editing and other technology to make the population healthier. I'm less interested in sort of the Peter Thiel, how can I extend my life so that I can achieve world domination.
So just following up on that, I think that, again, the emphasis on markets, particularly in Silicon Valley, and the resistance to any sense that what one can do in markets is acceptable, is an interesting theme. And I tend to be a pro-market person in general. However, as we have seen over the last, in extending the conversation beyond just life extension to the role of Silicon Valley more generally in our society, I think as we have seen, there are lots of cleavages, shall we say, that Silicon Valley has fostered and exacerbated. And I think there's still a bubble there. I was just out there last week, and there's still a sense of, we're the best people and we are going to not only save the world and extend our lives forever, but also improve humanity generally. And it is a sort of an interesting bubble in which to live, but I think it is there. And, and many of my, as they say, many of my good friends live in that bubble, so what can I say? But it's something that you should keep in mind, because it's certainly the case that, we too, even in a elite university like Duke, live in a bubble. We should keep in mind that most people do not live in that circumstance, and most people are struggling to, struggling with opioid abuse, and many people anyway, and their life expectancy in general, as you well know, in the United States is not increasing. So there are huge distributional issues here, and I think it would be remiss if we didn't keep those in mind. We would be remiss if we didn't keep those in mind.
I guess my perspective in reflecting on the comments we just heard would be, I mean, one thing I guess I'd point out is that I think there's a lot of things that seem far-fetched that probably aren't, as kind of a scientist in the weeds on this stuff, that probably aren't as far-fetched as you might think if we're thinking on time frame of decades, right? Because there's stuff like CRISPR, like gene editing and germline editing and all this other stuff that, even someone who's an expert in the field would have thought impossible 5-10 years ago, and now it's just like amazing what can happen. And then on a week-to-week basis, there's kind of amazing new technologies that are allowing us to manipulate things. And certainly, I mean, there's experiments in animals that come up with different ways to extend life, extend regeneration, extend memory and learning, and all of these other things. So I think that it's not, I think it would be wrong to think that it's ridiculous that some of these technologies are on the horizon, if we're talking about a horizon of decades and some approaches to do this. And then the other, I guess, comment back to the question about, who keeps an eye on this and regulation and who decides when we've gone too far. I guess my general reflection on that would be that it shouldn't be people like me who are making that decision, right? Because we're just in the weeds with our pipetters doing our experiments, and I definitely would advocate that you shouldn't leave it because, we're just thinking about the science, and I think we do our best to think about the general picture, but we're not really good at that. And I think that, so having some broader oversight, and I think that in some instances, there's examples of where that's been done, where there was there was this presidential commission on synthetic biology, or the whole National Academy's Symposium and the follow-up on genome editing and germline editing. So I think that there is some good effort in trying to keep an eye on these things, but I think certainly having a community outside of the scientists who are down in the weeds helping to regulate this is probably important.
Can I just ask you a science follow-up? So these experiments, for example, in roundworms, where we've identified genes that if we perturb them, we can make worms live, 5 times longer than they usually do. We can get mice to live 30% longer than they usually do. In terms of human health, are you optimistic about that? Would you, if you were handing out money, would you prioritize those approaches?
Well, okay, so I guess there's a couple of questions there that I think are really different. Am I optimistic about these approaches? Again, because I don't think it's important to give like a timeline here. It's not like something I think is going to happen tomorrow, but on the timeline of decades, finding biomolecules that if you administer them will help extend or delay aging of tissues, sure. I mean, I guess I'd be surprised if someone would argue that point, right? I mean, we've got these studies where you take a young mouse, you hook up its circulation to an old mouse, and the old mouse does better, right? Ages slowly, has some reversal of aging and some symptoms, and then they can go into the blood and pull out certain molecules that they think, although I think there's still certainly a lot of work that needs to be done there, that they can identify some of these things that help rejuvenate the old mouse. So that's still really, really early work, and in some cases controversial work, but it's on its way, right? That's not that far from saying, okay, here's a protein, you take it and you do better. So I think that on the time frame of decades, am I optimistic that type of stuff, we will have ideas about how to do that? The answer would be yes. Now, a very different question that you asked is, if I was prioritizing where to put out money, would it be there? That's a tough one. I mean, obviously, that's not as I think was mentioned, these issues are maybe not the most pressing in terms of human health across the board. But how to actually prioritize that is really fascinating. So Jay Bradner, who runs research for Novartis, he had these quote like yesterday or the day before, that he thinks there's too much money going into oncology. And that's what he does. Like, he is an oncologist, and he thinks that because there's too much redundant money. And so while cancer might be an example of something that's one of the most pressing human health needs, there's billions and billions of dollars that are going in that are a lot of doing the same thing over and over again. And frankly, I'm not informed enough to know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I thought it was interesting that the guy who runs cancer research for Novartis thinks there's too much money in his area.
I think that's a really interesting segue into our next question. There's advances in the lab when you find really interesting preliminary data about whether it's using blood for anti-aging, but how quickly we maybe take it to the market before it's been fully validated or researched. And one thing that's really interesting in the scientific community is a history of self-regulation. So whether it's the Asalomer conference in the 80s or the CRISPR moratorium in 2015 or even this recent presidential commission, in general, scientists do step up when they think there are maybe ethical breaks that need to be hit for research. But at the same time, science is a community, and there are members in maybe the fringes of the community, like in China, as you alluded to, or even this past year in Oregon State, who maybe go a little further. And so, Professor Gersbach, I'm curious, as someone who's a practitioner of the bench, what do you think the role, or what do you think the way this community should operate to try to self-regulate before laws and policies can be made at the federal or state level?
Yeah, so I don't have all the answers to that. I mean, maybe what I'd say is that, I have been impressed with the efforts that some of the leading scientists in these fields have advocated for self-regulation, right? So if you look at people like Jennifer Doudna and George Church, I think that they are very good at advocating, from what I can tell, for self-regulation. The whole moratorium issue was led by Jennifer Doudna. So I think that those are good examples where I think that for the most part, the leading scientists in the field aren't totally opposed to this or don't understand the need for it. And I think that my impression is they've done a reasonable job of bringing people from outside just the scientists that are working on those problems. Now, whether it's enough, I think, is probably a whole other issue, right? So, the CRISPR moratorium thing, which I was not involved in, so I don't know all of the details, but I thought it was kind of fascinating that they had this big meeting and this big committee, and they decided that, okay, wait a minute, we should slow down here, we should have a moratorium, we should better understand before we do any kind of germline editing. And then reports of germline editing in China came out, and so the US European group said, actually, let's just go ahead because they're going to do it, so we should do it anyway. And the moratorium, I guess, was lifted, and so it didn't last very long. But I think but it certainly generated a lot of reflection. I go to probably a CRISPR conference once a month, and the vast majority of them now have a session dedicated to ethics or a speaker dedicated to ethics, and I think that's been, at least it keeps us thinking about it. I don't know that I have an answer. I guess I could just say that I think it's good to see that scientists are keeping this in mind, that they are, leading scientists are advocating for self-regulation. It's not clear to me if it's enough, if you think that, what they did at Oregon Health was going too far. That's probably a debatable point.
Can you just tell the uninitiated what that experiment was?
Yeah, so so I mean, we're all talking about the CRISPR gene editing. We didn't really do an introduction. The idea is going in and changing underlying genome sequences. And there's a lot of this that is not widely considered controversial. So for example, if you want to take cells in a dish and you want to modify some gene sequences to study how those genes function so that you can make drugs that regulate them to treat disease, everyone is pretty much, agrees that that's okay. The next level up would be like modifying animal models like mice, to make genetically engineered mice to help model disease, to help develop drugs and understand disease. And that's generally considered fine. Almost every university in the country now has their own little core facility that'll do this. The next level up would be actually treating humans, and this is something that is actually now moving into clinical trials. There are ongoing clinical trials that are doing this, where they actually take these gene editing tools like CRISPR or other things like it, and they will modify cells, modify the genomes within cells in order to treat a disease. Now, everything that's being done in that space right now is what is referred to as somatic cell gene editing, meaning that it's only modifying the cells in the body that are affected by the disease, or at least that's the intention. So if you have an immune disease, then they go in and they modify the immune cells. If you have a liver disease, then they go in and modify the liver cells, and it's isolated to those cells and that tissue and that's an individual. And that's generally considered acceptable, and as I mentioned, there's multiple clinical trials now that are doing that. Now, where it starts to get very controversial is what's called germline gene editing, and that involves making changes to gene sequences in germ cells like egg and sperm or single cell embryos. And now the issue there is that now you're going to, if that cell or that fertilized embryo then moves on to develop into a whole organism, every cell in that organism will be modified. And so not only if anything that was intended to happen, but anything that unintended will now exist in all of those cells. And then furthermore, any progeny from that animal or human, because the germ cells in that person are also, or animal, are also modified, will get those intended, will get those genetic modifications. So germline gene editing is certainly something that's very controversial, and it mixes not only genome editing, but ethical issues around embryonic stem cells. And so the concern was, should we allow that type of research to go forward? And originally in the US and Europe, there was this kind of moratorium that we weren't going to do that because of some of the ethical issues. It was then, there were a couple of publications that came out of China showing that this was happening over there. And now, more recently, there was a study out of the UK that came out first, where they got permission from the government to do some gene editing in fertilized embryos for basic research. And the idea is these fertilized embryos are not, and I forget the exact stage that they're not allowed to go past, but they only get to a certain stage and then terminated. And then more recently at Oregon Health Sciences Center, University? Oregon Health Sciences University, there was a researcher that did a similar type of experiment. And
And I think a lot of those cases, one of the most notable things that happened in the recent months is there was a company called Spark Therapeutics up in Philadelphia that led the first sort of true gene therapy trial in human patients in the United States, where they targeted a gene called RP65, which is for congenital blindness. And they did that at sort of the somatic stage after patients had already come to sort of childhood and been born, and not at the germline stage. But it's conceivable that now that they have such positive results and this will be clinically approved, that very soon these types of therapies could be scaled. And so I'm curious, Professor Angrist, Professor Wright, what do you think the jump needs to be for the FDA or other regulatory bodies to develop new frameworks for maybe germline or even just very early stage childhood gene therapies?
So you're specifically talking about germline. Well, that'll be very interesting. I think just getting the somatic piece right is going to be interesting in and of itself. It's intriguing to me that you brought up Spark Therapeutics. I've been working with them a little bit through the Margolis Center on setting up reimbursement models. So one thing it should be obvious for all of these therapies, even if we're talking about somatic, is that they're going to be incredibly expensive, and how to determine who gets them and who doesn't is an ethical issue in and of itself, and that's something that I think one should, if one is interested in ethics, should always keep in mind. You know, my sense is that the germline question will get, as it always does, get tied up with abortion politics. This issue of abortion politics has come up every time we start talking about anything germline, and so you know, it came up with embryonic stem cells. It's a having now been around the block many times on these questions, and there is a every once in a while there's a legislation, and it's now in our patent system, saying that you can't have patents directed to a human organism, but of course no one defines what human organism means because that gets tied up in abortion politics. So I think the FDA, depending on the administration, and probably irrespective of the administration, will be very wary of approving germline modification as a therapy. Largely, or if not, well, in part at least, for abortion politics reasons.
And I think that's an interesting point too, this idea of market forces when it comes to pushing these technologies forward, and then the way that policy maybe stops it, or at least holds back temporarily. And so one thing I'd like to talk about next is the role of property rights in governing these regimes, especially as gene technologies have advanced, whether it's the Chakraborty case in the 80s or the Myriad case in the 2000s, there have definitely been landmark legal challenges for the law to try to regulate those technologies. And so I'm curious, Professor Gersbach, in your own sort of private enterprises here at Duke, or Professor Rod, from your work at USPTO, what are some of the challenges in defining a property regime for these technologies, given that in Frankenstein, Victor kind of considers the creature his own property?
So I'll just do a little bit of level setting with respect to what patents do and don't confer in terms of property. So one of the things that I do try to proselytize about is that there is this ownership fallacy with respect to patents that really needs to be, I think, tackled head on. And the fallacy is as follows: that patents confer an affirmative ownership right. They do not. They confer only a right to exclude, which means that if, for whatever reason, one wants to, as a regulatory matter, declare certain types of work, scientific research, off limits, that's perfectly consistent with the patent system. In fact, there have been patents on all sorts of mechanisms for making illegal drugs, for example, which presumably one could never actually use. I guess one could exclude others from using, but that wouldn't be very useful since they couldn't use them either. So that's the so-called ownership fallacy that I think you should be clear about. And so to that extent, some of the rhetoric one might hear about people through the patent system being able to own others or things that look like human beings is just incorrect. Now, but that ownership fallacy is something that Congress has subscribed to as well, so hence the idea that patents can't be directed to a human organism. That's in our patent statute now as a consequence of a congressman named Kurt Weldon, who didn't understand patents basically, and so has put in what I think is a very, the biotech companies lobbied against it. I think it's a very unfortunately drafted provision about human organisms. Nobody knows what that means, and I don't know if it's actually chilling research because, I don't know that many people are chilled necessarily, but it's in there and it's kind of a problem. So the property rights question is not a patent question really. It ends up ultimately being a question of how a property interest might be created, say, through state law. It's conceivable at least that a state could allow a property interest, but of course that would be presumably countermanded by the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery or involuntary servitude. So I think the property kind of specter has been overplayed. Now, it has been overplayed in ways that I think are absolutely deleterious as well, and maybe Misha and I will disagree on this point. So in the Myriad case, the ACLU went around saying that, Myriad owns your genes. Well, that's just fallacious. They don't own your genes. They own an isolated and purified version, or they did before the patents were struck down. And so there's a lot of rhetoric in this space that I find not helpful, to put it mildly. And one of the things I try to do when I go around to general audiences is try to disabuse people of the idea that patents will actually end up being the thing you worry about. There are many other things to worry about, but patents are not the thing.
I'm trying to think what else I can add to that. I think, thinking about it from another context of like some of the property around some of these technologies, I guess I would also agree that I think it's to a large extent been overblown. I mean, one example that's relevant to things that we're more involved in is all of the commotion around who owns the intellectual property around CRISPR. And I think one of the fascinating pieces of information is everyone's very worried about who owns it and how that's going to control all this money making and all of the rest of it. But it didn't, the fact that today there's still a lot of controversy about who owns what hasn't stopped there from being multiple biotech companies raise billions of dollars and go public and start clinical trials. So there seems to be a lot of this discussion around, it's going to be critical as to who owns it, but the reality of the situation is that if you look at it, there's a bunch of academic places that are starting clinical trials with these technologies that have no particular rights to the technology. There's a bunch of companies that are moving forward that are having no trouble, at least in the current climate, raising money and to move forward with these things. So I think, I guess the optimist in me likes to think that if you're able to do something good and valuable and helpful, then the patent issues won't necessarily get in your way, and there's a way to address any intellectual property concerns down the road when you have something that is valuable and helpful to people. I think not everyone agrees with that, but and I think that's also partly reflected by the current climate where there is a lot of money to fund these things, but I think that's been our experience.
So I'll just add on that piece. So that's a distinct axis that Professor Gersbach is talking about, which is not necessarily the ethical axis, but whether these patents will end up creating, and the controversies over them will create what economists would call transaction cost problems, which is not necessarily an ethical issue, although if it precludes research, maybe it is. I think reasonable minds can differ on that. I think that the controversies have certainly not been social welfare enhancing, let's put it that way. It would have been good if Berkeley and Harvard and the Broad had been able to resolve their differences without spending a lot of money on lawyers, and I say this as a lawyer, because lawyers are not social welfare enhancing for the most part.
Well, so I'll just ask a follow-up, and that is, do you anticipate that this food fight between Broad and Berkeley will ultimately translate into transaction costs that are ultimately passed on to patients? And then the other question is, will, say, exclusive ownership, that is one side or the other winning the battle, lead to what we saw with Myriad, which was a hoarding of data and a lack of data in the public sphere?
Great questions on both points. So I'll speak first to the first one. Yeah, it's certainly possible to lead to transaction costs because basically, and I'm not a PhD economist, but I've studied a lot of economics as a consequence of now doing patent law. Basically, if you have a reach-through royalty, that automatically adds to the cost of the ultimate therapy. If the deal is structured on the patent as something that's other than a reach-through royalty, if it's just a lump sum payment, well, then it's not going to add ultimately to the cost that the patient bears, although it might preclude certain lines of inquiry if it's just too costly to pay the lump sum payment. But yeah, reach-through royalties certainly add to patient costs, and that's just economically true. Now, hoarding of data, that's really interesting, and I can't necessarily speak with any full knowledge about that question, but look, data is has been now the new oil for a long time, much more so than patents. And yeah, I'm sure, well, there's probably going to be hoarding of data irrespective of patents. The difference is with patents, maybe, just maybe, as with Myriad, you can prevent others from creating their own data for a while. It sounds like from what Dr. Gersbach is saying, and from what I understand, most academics are just ignoring the patents. So maybe, that's that's not going to create a myriad type situation as a consequence. But everyone's going to hoard their data because that's what academics do, and that's just the way it is.
I guess, again, maybe trying to think that all I agree with. I think things I can add to that. The fact, one of the interesting side effects, and I can see a situation where, for example, if everyone had access to all of the CRISPR technology broadly in some way, that would be desirable for some reasons. I think one of the interesting side effects of having several parties think that in the end that they will be the owner of the technology is that it's allowed them to go out and make their case, and each of them independently raise billions of dollars. And then the idea that the side effect of them all, are arguing that they'll be the ones to own the property means that there's a lot of competition. So on the one hand, if Broad and Berkeley had solved their differences and then made it broadly available, then I could see where that would be really helpful for a lot of reasons. I'm not sure if that was actually, if they had resolved their differences or if one person had just won outright. I'm not sure that that's exactly what would have happened. I think that another possible scenario is if one person holds all the rights and then that one person hoards them, then you don't have the current situation, which is multiple entities all competing with each other. But also I think an interesting side effect of this is that they've all carved out their own areas. So there's three main CRISPR gene editing therapeutic companies out there, and one of them is focused on eye diseases, another is focused on blood diseases, and another is focused on liver diseases. It's not clear to me whether that was something that there was kind of an agreement that we won't step on each other's toes for the time being, or if it just happened that way. But I think that if all of the control of the intellectual property was in one place, no one entity can pursue all of these different things. And so I think one nice thing that's out there, either whether it's academics not minding infringing and moving forward with academic trials, or the fact that there's multiple entities out there all advocating that they have the rights, means that there's lots of competition and kind of more application across a broader swath of diseases than there might be under other scenarios.
So we've talked a lot now about the ethics and the law and the policy. I'd like to now pivot to, I think, an important stakeholder group that maybe hasn't been talked about, which is the public. A lot of times, our perceptions of these things are filtered both first through media and through academia, but at the same time, technology will move faster maybe than some of those institutions can respond. And so, Professor Angrist, you wrote a book, Here Lies a Human Being, after the Human Genome Project, sort of conceptualizing our response, our new perception of what it means to be human in an era in which now our genome is on full display and we have the opportunity to see what are the building blocks that comprise mankind. And so I'm curious, what would your take be now as we pivot to the second generation of genomics in the era where that data is now actionable? How does the public, and what is the role of the public's perception of these new technologies?
Well, that's an easy question. The short answer is I don't think anyone really knows. So I think we have some sort of, we have a long-tailed distribution, which with maybe peaks at either end. So on the one hand, this week there was a paper published in the New England Journal describing gene therapy for beta thalassemia. And I don't know what Charlie thinks. I thought the data, at least as I read them through my naive, jaundiced eyes, were remarkable. This is a disease that has been with us for however many thousands of years. We've had a molecular understanding of it for many decades. And now we've reached this place where we have this technology where it seems like most of the patients who got this therapy no longer need blood transfusions, they no longer have to incur iron toxicity, and that is absolutely remarkable. At the other end, and I feel somewhat disheartened by this as the editor of a consumer genomics magazine, we have these more frivolous manifestations of consumer genetics, and I say that not judging people who choose to buy these kits that would purport to tell them what kind of wine they should drink or whether their child will be a soccer star or whatever. But, you know, in 2013, the FDA smacked down 23andMe and said, you know, you guys are making a medical device and you have to come correct and get your house in order. And, you know, you have to follow the rules and make sure what you're doing is clinically sound. And my concern is that a lot of these kind of lifestyle tests, these companies have sort of absorbed exactly the wrong lesson, at least wrong in my opinion, from what the FDA chose to do and said, well, you know what, we're not actually going to traffic, we're not going to get into the business of telling people their risk for single gene disorders. We're going to, you know, sell them on wine and diet and athletics and all of this stuff, and we're not going to bother their pretty little heads with being transparent about what science we're consulting or which SNPs we're genotyping. And so to me, that just feels like a missed opportunity. And I feel a little sheepish because I suspect when I wrote my book, my 10-year ago self would have laughed at what I'm saying now.
So I don't have a lot to add to what Misha is saying. I think the FDA is trying to parse the distinction between consumer health and real health as best it can, because it doesn't want to, again, it's the logic of the market. We don't want people to not be able to get access to stuff, information, so long as it doesn't affirmatively harm them. Who cares if, you know, they spend their time in frivolous ways? That's just what America's all about, right? And so, you know, I can see
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah, exactly. And so I can see where, you know, why the FDA is parsing the line in the way they are in their most recent guidance on mobile health and what constitutes software that has to be regulated by the FDA definitely toes that same line. You know, whether I think that's the way to make a good society, well, unfortunately, I don't think so, but who am I? Because I'm not, you know, I'm not supposed to be telling people what to do in this country, so, you know, all I can say is that I don't think that this is a useful way to spend one's money, but, you know, people can do what they want.
Yeah, this is maybe a tangential comment, but when I think where it gets really interesting about everyone having access to their own genetic information as it relates to things like gene therapy and CRISPR. So things like beta thalassemia, they're very attractive, or things like sickle cell disease in particular, are attractive for gene therapy applications because it's always the same mutation. You've got a large patient population and they always have the same mutation. And so these are the types of diseases where things like CRISPR are being first applied. What's going to be really interesting is when we get to a place where gene editing is safe and validated and we can do it to correct genetic disease, but when we start finding mutations that are N of 1 and they're actionable, we know just how to fix them, but there's no regulatory framework to kind of make a custom therapy for every N of 1 individual. So I think that we're heading in that direction. I know there's people thinking about this, that, you know, technology's not quite there yet, but I don't think there's any reason to think that it won't get there. But we'll have a bunch of people with all of their own individual private mutations, and right now we don't know how to move that forward.
So let me just follow up on that. Even before you get to N of 1, you can get to N's of, you know, 1,000 or 2,000, or, you know, what's happening these days is that orphan drugs are the big killer app for a lot of drug companies. And one question that, you know, everyone is raising is, you know, is the way that we have subsidized orphan drugs tenable, you know, as a social matter, because the costs are just through the roof. And, you know, not everyone can have their own therapy. that's why we've moved, fortunately, from personalized medicine to precision medicine, but even precision medicine is going to be really expensive.
And so for, I think, our final question of the panel, to pivot back to this core idea of when does science and the quest for knowledge go too far? In Silicon Valley or in tech, the motto is sort of move fast and break things. And at least in science, maybe peer review checks some of that a little bit. But as some of these technologies really push the boundaries of what we consider to be conventional boundaries on science or on gene editing or stem cells, I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on what do you think is the next boundary that'll be broken and how should we respond to it?
Let's start with the scientist.
So I think the first part of it, I think that this whole idea of moving slowly is really important. I know like in the CRISPR field, people are kind of scared to death that something will happen like a Jesse Gelsinger incident and set everyone back. So, and it's fascinating, I work closely with a lot of the kind of leading gene editing companies, and watching how safe they're being is amazing to me. Like it's reassuring. I mean, they're being very careful, but what drives them nuts and the rest of us is those who aren't being careful, right? So someone on Facebook who wants to inject himself with CRISPR, and whether it even is CRISPR or not or whatever, if who knows what they're injecting themselves with, but if it hurts somebody, then that's going to set everyone back. Or if it happens in a country where there isn't as tight regulation and someone plows forward, and if there's an adverse event that has nothing to do with CRISPR, it's going to really set everything back. And so I think that this idea of being slow and moving forward carefully is really important. And I think that the leading people are cognizant of that, but not everyone is. So we've got to figure that part out. Your question about what's next. So, I think one of the obvious things that is next when if you talk about after stem cells or gene editing is going to be that's already starting to come about is this idea of synthesizing the human genome from scratch. So that's something where there's already a human right genome project, and that's already stirred some controversy. But this idea of when we get to a place, which they've already done it in bacteria, and I think that there's no reason to think that there won't be a time in the future where you can synthesize a whole genome from scratch. So going from CRISPR and modifying a base pair or two of a genome, but making the whole thing from design is probably going to be the next thing that will raise these types of issues. And it's already, there's projects underway to synthesize human chromosomes.
Yes, I'll agree with that in the sense that I think, whatever was called synthetic biology about 10 years ago is maybe finally, many years later, beginning to come to fruition. I worked on the synthetic biology sets of issues, I think a little bit too early because at that point they weren't really ready for prime time. And maybe I'll come back to those. So I think that will be, in the genomic space, that will be the next kind of Rubicon to cross. And that, just because I worked on that set of issues 10 years ago, one of the interesting pieces of it, and Dr. Gersbach spoke to the fact that there are irresponsible actors out there. So one can distinguish, I think, between two sets of irresponsible actors. One is the truly evil irresponsible actors, the people who want to do bad things. And so this is where the FBI gets very concerned and so forth and so on. And then there are and this is where things get more tricky, the sort of do-it-yourselfers and the open source people, the people who think that everyone should be a citizen scientist. And it's more tricky because on the one hand, for reasons that Dr. Gersbach mentioned, we don't want monopolies in this space. We want people, open source software has been a good thing in the main, and we want people to not necessarily have to be employed by a large firm or by a university in order to do some of this science, because perhaps there's a way to take this forward. That said, I was on a DARPA Defense Advisory Advanced Research Projects Advisory Board on synthetic biology, and Dr. Gersbach is exactly right. It scared the bejesus out of them that anyone would think about doing this DIY. So, I think that's right about synthetic biology. Now, outside the genomics field, the obvious thing is whatever artificial intelligence means, but we won't go there because that's sort of orthogonal to the subject of our panel.
So actually I just wrote a column about this guy in Silicon Valley who purported to inject himself with CRISPR therapy, and at South by Southwest was followed by someone else who knew, I would say, an order of magnitude less than the first guy, and was so sort of flamboyantly theatrical about this act that the first guy disavowed him and kind of expressed regret for having injected himself. So I think this is complicated. I'm working on a story right now about community laboratories, and I visited a lab in Brooklyn, really cool place where anybody can come and take a class. You know, it's like some people take a class in pottery. You can take a class in CRISPR. I took a class in manipulating cell-free DNA, because if you play with DNA outside the cell, then you escape all of these organismal risks and regulations. And so I interviewed the executive director, and at the end, I said, well, I have to ask you about Josiah Zahner and these DIY folks CRISPRing themselves. And he just rolled his eyes because, he's somebody who he is trying with his lab to set the standard for biosafety, and has regular contact actually with the FBI, and yet all anybody wants to talk about is, are you bringing people in to take your classes so that they can learn how to edit themselves? So I think I would hate to see efforts like that get tarred with this bad actor brush.
Awesome. Let's get a round for our panel. And before we wrap up, we have a few minutes to take questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, now's the time.
This may be inappropriate for this panel or for any panel. Perhaps it will be answered later. I'm a lawyer, and I think in legal liability terms, and if there is a consequence, you mentioned unintended consequences earlier, if there is a consequence to whatever that happens, and that consequence causes somebody damages, has there developed yet in the law much at all in terms of the liability aspect? And if there has, or even if there is yet to come, is there a distinction between unintended consequences, which perhaps would be less likely to create liability, versus reasonably foreseeable consequences? And to the extent of reasonably foreseeable, to what extent are these folks that are into this being in some way impressed with the need to focus on reasonably foreseeable consequences?
So I think that this goes to a bit to what we were talking about, so it's actually exactly on point. I think the big firms that are extremely well capitalized, that are deep pockets, in other words, are extremely aware of all the liability consequences. In fact, so much so that they don't want to transfer materials without assignment of liability or disavowal of liability. So, but the concern, of course, is that the people who are not deep pockets, and I think as a lawyer you know what that means, are the ones who also are not concerned. And so there's no deterrent effect because they're, as we call in the law, judgment proof. So there's nothing you can do about them through the tort system, at least. Maybe through criminal liability you can get at them in some way, but not through the tort system in any significant way.
Is the insurance industry into this?
Well, I'm quite sure that all of the firms that are working in this space have umbrella insurance for everything. But again, it's the question of people who are not going to be able to, you can't secure judgments from them in any way, shape, or form. That is, I think, the issue.
It looks like we're just out of time, so thank you again to our panel, and we'll break before our next one. Thank you.